Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Car One special lecture. And today we have a very special guest with us, Professor V.M. Jha sir. And he has been a speaker of Car One earlier as well. And today we have the honor of having him again to speak on a very special topic and even a very timely topic, I think, that is caste system in Gupta and post Gupta period. Dr. V.M. Jha is an associate professor at the Department of History, ARSD College at the University of Delhi. His area of specialization is ancient Indian history, and he has given lectures and many symposiums at various national and international forums, conferences, seminars, and contributed chapters in various publications. Dr. V.M. Jha has also he is also editing the first volume of A Comprehensive History of India, Part 2, along with Professor K.M. Srimali, who is a very eminent historian. And I think this is one of Professor Jha's recent research, caste system in Gupta and post-Gupta period. So without further ado, I would formally invite and formally welcome Professor Jha to deliver this lecture. Thank you so much sir, for accepting our invitation and over to you.
Thank you, Eshan. Uh, the research is not new, the presentation is. Uh, and in course of preparing for this lecture, there has been some fresh research, but it's an old issue uh, I have been taken up with over past several years. And today I would like to share those with this audience. I believe the audience will include some of my undergraduate students too, and it will of course have people of much greater eminence uh, than I can ever hope to claim. So let's begin by uh, defining the terms and then stating the problems before we come to more substantive discussion. So let's first the period. The Gupta period may be presumed to have begun about AD 300 or so. The post-Gupta period will here refer to the period up to circa AD 750. This period of 4th to mid-8th century goes back. In an earlier scheme, Bharati Vidya Bhavan series and earlier, so there used to be a conception of a classical age or the uh, all right. So this classical age would include not just Gupta period, as in HCIP volume, History and Culture of Indian People volume, it includes the entire period from 4th to mid-8th century. This preceded the age of imperial Kannauj, and then after we have uh, the struggle for empire, and then Sultanate period and so on. So this period, coming back to this period, so it's an old scheme of dividing Indian history from 4th to mid-8th century AD. In later historiography, this becomes the age of transition, one of origins and early development of feudalism before the period of full-fledged political polity and economy. I'm referring to R.S. Sharma's Indian feudalism. So it was first delivered in the form of lectures in 1964. It comes out as a book in the next year. So there we have the first chapter is one of origins and early development. And this first chapter refers to this period where it's seen as transitional uh, in early Indian history, the period when ancient India begins to be transformed into early medieval India. So after this period, according to Sharma's thesis, there was the period of full-fledged feudal polity and economy from mid-8th century to about AD 1000. And then we have finally the period of the climax and cracks of the feudal setup from 1000 to 1200. So this idea, the basic idea of Sharma's of the period being a transitional one, it caught on. And it has now come to be established in a number of recent surveys of early Indian uh, history. For instance, in Professor Romila Thapar's Early India, this period is presented as threshold times, the term which Professor Ranbir Chakravarti also likes, and so on. But it may be significant. Now I'm coming to the problem. It may be significant that the chronologies do not match exactly. In one account, in Sharma's account, it's 300 to 750. In Thapar's, it's 300 to 700. For Ranbir Chakravarti, the threshold times are, they end at 600, one full century earlier. They all are historians who take their sources very seriously. No one can possibly be more aware than these eminences of history being a time science. So it could be significant that these chronologies about the transitional periods do not match exactly. So for historians, for historiography, here is a problem. So that these threshold times, these transitional times, they remain troubled times for the historical profession, came out dramatically a few years ago when the leading authorities of India put their heads together to frame history syllabus for undergraduate students in the choice-based credit system, the famous or not so famous CBCS. It was introduced, I think, in the year 2015 or 16. And so here we have the syllabi for different courses being prepared by a team of the leading historians of India. So here the transition topic, transition when early historical India began to be transformed into early medieval India. So it's a very basic topic. So it has therefore to be learned by both the honors and the program students, BA honors and BA program students. However, while for the honors course, the transition period is about 450 years, circa AD 300 to circa AD 750, the same as ours. For the program courses, it is a severely truncated one. It's a mere 2 last centuries of it, from 550 to 750. So I should like to share with you people uh, the syllabus. This is history honors, all right? So
Can you see it?
it can be seen now?
Yes.
All right, so this is the CBCS syllabus that we have been teaching with a few modifications last year, year before last, since 2016. So this is the topic. Eshantu must have done it. So it's towards early medieval India. What does it say? Circa 4th century to 750 CE. All right. Now we come to BA program. I teach both classes. I from 12:30 to 1:30. My lecture is for program students. Then I go to the next class, next room, to see my honors students. So it's being inverted here. In BA program, look what it is. The first period, 300 to 550, the first period, it is simply the Guptas and Vakatakas, state and administration, economy, society, religion, art, not a word on transition. Transition did occur, but only after it. The next topic is towards the early medieval, Pallava, Chalukyas, Vardhanas. All right. So we can see this. So this is a major issue then. For as much as a quarter millennium, this Gupta period is no ordinary period. So for this, as much as a quarter millennium of a very well documented and among the most intensively studied periods of early Indian history, the historical profession does not feel sure whether it was a transitional period or not. As I said, I happen to teach both. I can hardly escape being troubled and so troubling my students with this nagging issue. And I am here to trouble you all with a part of it. It's a massive thing: economy, society, polity, culture. So caste system does form a significant, if not so popular part of it, popular with historians or students. So that's what I'm here for. So, so we have this problem. So there's an enormously significant swath of doubt, including self-doubts and ambiguity, which marks the professional historian's understanding of the threshold times. What can be done about it? What is to be done about it? So if we are to reduce the big margin of uncertainties in the current interpretations about the character of this period of early Indian history, it's my belief that we must begin with the questions of method. We must begin with a questioning of the manner in which the sources have been read to reach or to reach this or that interpretation. Very briefly, we will need to do three things for the beginning. For any given period or region, we will need to go in for, it's most crucial, for a non-selective handling of evidence. Examine the evidence in the totality, the entirety of a text. If I look up this page of Al-Biruni, I must look up the next one too, and I must look up the entire text of Al-Biruni, or the entire range of available texts, as well as non-textual materials. Unfortunately, the tendency has been to look for this or that piece of self-serving reference. We will need to go beyond this. Examples will be given shortly. Second, we will need to refer to the relevant evidence from the other periods or regions as checks on the interpretation for the period and region in question. Comparative method within this period itself, and of course from outside our early Indian history. So, and third, historians of early India, for want of better evidence mostly, one can already understand, others will need to understand our plight. But there has been also a somewhat facile, easy tendency to take inference for evidence. This too, we must beware. We need to maintain, as I hope to show through certain examples, a sharp distinction between evidence and inference. We will need to entertain all possible inferences instead of insisting upon a particular one without further warrant. So this is the statement of method. We will keep returning to it in course of this lecture. But before that, I must also present, for clarity of discussion, a working definition of the caste system. Working definition meaning the definition which I work with and certain initial hypotheses. So by caste system, I will mean a system in which endogamous groups, these groups have mostly been jatis, but could also be Varna groups in early Indian history. The point is about the importance, the centrality of endogamy. So a caste system is a system in which endogamous groups relate, whether individually, a caste by itself, or in clusters, in combinations, to one another. How do they relate to one another? They may relate to one another individually or in combination, either hierarchically or competitively. There may be contestations, but to contest, to put forward alternative claims, is also to subscribe to the notion of hierarchy. For a long time, there was no Ambedkar. So till we have such notions as Samya or annihilation of caste, so we belong to the caste system. All right. So we need to in my view, the caste system, in this caste system, the identity of the basic group is defined by the principle of endogamy, which makes it different from other groupings that may be or are often endogamous, but that is not the binding principle of the group. It is endogamy as the organizing principle, as distinct from the mere fact of marriages taking place within an observed group. That is the criterion for me. For most of the time, hierarchy of status, privileges, and deprivations was the hallmark of the system, but the erosion or negation of the hierarchy has only meant a renewal of the system for other purposes. All this while, the basic group identity continues to be based on the principle of endogamy. This brings us to the question of the connection, historically or otherwise, between a profession and a caste identity. So we all know that there are professions distinctive of a caste group. But a change of profession by itself will not lead to the dissolution of the group identity till such time that the new professionals refuse to or are denied marriage within the caste. That is the reason we hear of Kshatriya merchants or Shudra kings. They did not give up their identity because they remained part of the respective endogamous groups. A member of the carpenter caste will not lose his caste identity through change of profession so long as he or his family members are not denied or they choose not to opt for marriage with the other families of the caste. So this is the definition of caste system. Then when talk about hierarchy, hierarchies may or may not correspond to the norms of the Dharmashastric texts. So this is one important question of method. So the relevance or the manner in which the Dharmashastra texts, they present formidable, massive evidence. So they have to be taken, we can take it or leave it. It has been the tendency generally to leave it, but we cannot ignore it. So the statements on the caste system, you read any Dharma Shastra, you will find a statement on the caste system. So the statements on the caste system are found in the Dharma Shastra texts, but their relation to the actual working of a given caste system will vary from case to case. The customary rules and practices of caste society, and thus its caste ideology, may differ qualitatively from or correspond in varying degrees to those of Brahmanical texts. It may not be the same, but it may not be unrelated to that. What's more important, there is a need to realize the plural complexity of Dharmashastric evidence. There is nothing called the Shastric evidence or a given Dharmashastric evidence. The evidence is very complex, and there can be very enormous differences between the view of one author of a Dharmashastra and that of another. It has changed from region to region, it has changed over the centuries. But we also need to realize that the Dharmashastric evidence may not all be just prescriptive or normative, that it may as well represent non-normative reality. More than 5,000 Dharmashastras have been counted. The great majority of them represent a tradition of commentaries on certain basic text. So without this hierarchization, this rich tradition of Dharma Shastra commentaries will lose its very rationale, its Rajadatra, unless they held a material significance for the people in question. All right. So I'm sorry, this statement, the early statement of the questions of method, of historiography and all, it has taken more time than probably it would do for other topics. So now we come to certain issues about it won't be possible to survey all aspects of the caste system in this short lecture. All right. So there are certain dominant themes which we read about, which we teach in our classes about caste system in the Gupta and post-Gupta period. A very influential thesis is that of the decline of the Vaishyas and rise of the Shudras. So a major transformation occurs in the Varna structure, in the composition of Varnas during these transitional times. Agriculture, which was considered so far generally the work of the Vaishyas, now comes increasingly to be seen as the occupation of the Shudras. The best known statement is that of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang. We have it on his authority that agriculturists were Shudras, period. Flat statement. And building up on this, so an elaborate theory of how this transformation takes place during these centuries has been worked out. It was first worked out by R.S. Sharma in his Shudraj in Ancient India, and it has since been very influential. Sharma delighted in controversies. He was subjected to searching criticism from all points of view. Never on this one. Not all historians, not all the critics of Sharma have been interested in this thesis of his, but those who have been, they find his account, in the words of Irfan Habib, practically definitive. Irfan Habib doesn't agree at all with Sharma's thesis of Indian feudalism. He has his own understanding, very different. Even Suvira Jaiswal, who would defend Sharma from his other critics on so many other issues, here, and but she also likes to be critical of Sharma. I mean, whenever she finds the evidence or the proper method doesn't support Sharma's thesis, she has also criticized him, but not on this basic theme. All right, so what's the meaning of this? If we go into the details, the meaning of this statement that during Gupta and post-Gupta period, so a radical transformation takes place with the decline of the Vaishyas and the rise of the Shudras. What's the evidence? The evidence is this, that in the earlier law books, for instance, in the Manusmriti, agriculture is the occupation of Vaishyas. And at the other end, from 7th century onwards, from the time of the Chinese pilgrim, agriculture becomes the occupation of Shudras. What can be the meaning of this? This evidence that agriculturists are being now called Shudras, it has been interpreted in three very different ways. First, it has been said that this amounts to a marked improvement in the status of Shudras. Shudras had so far been providers of all kinds of services to the upper Varnas. Shudras had been slaves, they had been agricultural laborers. Their position improves. Now they become land-holding peasants like the Vaishyas. From being slaves, servants, or agricultural laborers, Shudras are now land-holding peasants like other Vaishyas. This is the first interpretation of this statement, of this observation in the sources. Second is very different. It's not the Shudras who are improving their status, who are no longer slaves or agricultural laborers, but now they are landholding peasants like the Vaishyas. No, it's not that. It's that the Vaishya peasantry have been downgraded to the status of Shudras. And this has happened because of the growing practice of land grants. With land grants came the landlords or landed intermediaries. These landed intermediaries were given an enormous powers, including the right to abuse their powers. One favorite statement of Sharma is that they were given the right to collect uchit, that is proper, as well as anuchit, improper taxes, though I don't think that is the correct meaning of uchit or anuchit. But this is the argument, that the Vaishyas, so they are becoming servile. With these land grants, they are losing their traditional rights. All right, so this was a downgrading of Vaishya peasants. This is the second interpretation. But the same thing, the observation that Shudras are being called agriculturists or agriculturists are now ranked as Shudras, it could have a third meaning too. It could refer to the phenomenon of the absorption of tribal people in caste society as Shudra peasantry. That here we have a problem drawing three kinds of inferences from the same problem, from the same evidence. It's scarcely realized, and it needs to be worked out. Theoretically, it is possible that the different statements, all those three things may have happened in different places, but they need to be shown through independent evidence. And then relate to this, then that needs to be related to this statement. Especially, where do we have the instance, any instance that a people, that agriculturists who were Vaishya so far, they were now being downgraded to the status of Shudras. So basically, to sum up, what is being said in this argument is that Vaishya agriculturists were reduced to such a state of servility that they lost their Varna status and began to be called Shudras. All right. With the growing number of grantees, agriculture becomes a servile occupation. That's why Vaishyas are now servile. They are Shudras. The second is very different. Shudras are no longer servile. They are no longer in the servile job of servants, slaves, and agricultural laborers, but they are now agriculturists like Vaishyas. So when Shudras are turning from laborers to agriculturists, it does not mean that agriculture is a servile occupation, but the Shudras have gone up and are no longer a servile Varna. The contradiction can scarcely been, but in point of fact, has regularly been missed. But the most important method, I do not have the time, I have worked it out at some length by looking at the citations, looking at the sources in detail, and then finding out. And I find that all those three methods, so they cry out for application in this instance. I should like to mention just, for instance, Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni has also been cited in support of this principle. But what has been missed, that Al-Biruni very categorically, this has completely been missed, and on the other hand, a very different interpretation. Al-Biruni has been cited to support Wensang, to Xuanshang. In point of fact, Al-Biruni reverts the statement of Xuanshang. He actually says that Shudras are not agriculturists, only Vaishyas are agriculturists. He even says that Shudras were prevented from becoming agriculturists. So this was my point about the need to get away from self-serving reference in this or that piece, to look at the totality of the evidence. The totality of the evidence, that much of evidence which I have been able to examine so far, from Manusmriti and Kautilya up to Al-Biruni and beyond. For instance, Irfan Habib, we have it from the pen of Irfan Habib himself, that the Jats in the medieval period, in the course of the long medieval period, after Sharma's Indian feudalism, by 17th century, Shudras were initially Chandals, they become Shudras, then they become Vaishyas. It's an onward, if prolonged, upward march of Jat peasantry, the most numerous peasantry of North India, in part of North India. In 17th century, one source calls them Vaishyas, of a lower status, but Vaishyas nevertheless. At one point, when they were in Sindh, they were Chandals, then they become Shudras. So matters are complex and not easy as they have been seen to be. On this question of the decline of Vaishyas, so similar thing about inferences. So the danger. Yes, one more thing. Apart from Al-Biruni, when I brought up the issue last week with a friend of mine, Dr. Ranjan Anand, so he didn't believe me, but then I showed him the reference. You see, whenever we teach about the status of peasantry on account of land grants in early medieval India, there is a feudalism debate, but on this there is no debate that whenever we have peasants or agricultural workers being transferred along with the land, they are being compelled to stay on the land. This is seen as evidence of their semi-servile status. They may not be complete serfs because they do not render agricultural services on the land. So that goes the argument. I'm not going there. But whenever we have this evidence, a piece of land, a village is being given away to religious beneficiaries, and it is stated that the peasantry, or sometimes the peasants or workers are named, that these people are being transferred along with that. We regularly say that this is the evidence. This evidence, again, has not been questioned so far in the debates about the dependent status, about the unfree status. May or may not be a serf, but no one would dispute that the peasants, the workers here were unfree. But the same evidence, exactly the same evidence, the same record, in fact, has been cited to argue the opposite, that when peasants or agricultural workers are being mentioned along with the transfer of land, it means a respect for their customary rights. It was something like land to the tiller argument that it means that they cannot be dispossessed, that they have succeeded in maintaining a permanent possession of their pieces of land. So whether land is transferred or not, they are going to stay. So far from being an indication of the unfreedom of the peasantry, exactly the opposite is being argued. It doesn't matter. In this case, it's the same person, but it doesn't matter if it's the same person or different persons have argued. We need to realize that from the same evidence, we have on different occasions inferred two mutually contradictory things. All right. So this point, I should like to illustrate with another instance, once again from a book which we cannot do without. All right. Ishan, is this visible?
Yes, sir.
This is a page number 303 from that classic of Romila Thapar's Early India. All right. So, just a moment. It's this statement. All right. So, what does it say? Categories of, it's a statement on slaves, on caste, on slavery. So categories of slaves were drawn more commonly from the lower castes and untouchables. There is a fuller treatment of slaves in the Dharma Shastras of this time than in the earlier ones, which suggests a greater use of slave labor, although it still did not reach anywhere near the proportion of slave labor in some other parts of the ancient world. But there is a continuing mention of hired labor that seems to have been used on a larger scale than before. The sources of the slaves were the usual: prisoners of war, debt bondsmen, and slaves born to slave women. But they also include the curious category of those who have revoked their vows of renunciation. The largest number of slaves seems to have been employed in domestic work. For labor in agriculture, there were other categories such as bonded labor, hired labor, and those required to perform stipulated jobs as a form of ishti, forced labor or labor tax. Caste regulations prevented the untouchables from being employed in domestic work, and so on. All right. So while you watch this, so I'll present my argument. So, I mean, it's the characteristically seamless flowing account of society in North India in threshold times. It's actually based on a large number of generalizations, and most of the generalizations are exactly that, what I've referred to just now. Inferences from this self-serving inferences. Something is being said, I won't mind what is being said elsewhere or in other part of the same evidence, I'll make use of that. Put a footnote, give the page number, job done. So the generalizations of this paragraph, so mostly they are based on similar inferences from this or that segment of this or that source. All right. But when you put them together, when we apply our mind to them, we begin to see the issues. And they arise, as I said, that each of these statements independently can be substantiated by reference to very standard works in the literature, secondary works in the literature. So let's take a closer look. So for instance, it's a perfectly reasonable thing. It's not necessary, but it's quite reasonable to say that a fuller statement, you see, fuller statement Means in the Dharma Shastras, if they are giving a fuller statement in the sources of this period, it will suggest a greater use of slave labor. Good enough, all right. But next sentence, what we read? Simply continuing mention of hired labor. Hired labor are mentioned earlier, hired labor are mentioned now. It's simply continuing mention. What does it mean? That slave labor was used on a larger scale than before. How can we do that? In fact, it's not even the right inference. Fuller treatment, greater use, okay. Continuing mention, larger scale, certainly doubtful. All right. Next, take this penultimate statement here. Caste regulations prevented the untouchables from being employed in domestic work. This one, the first one, categories of slaves, and this. So what is being said? Slaves were mostly lower castes and untouchables. All right. Slaves were mostly lower caste and untouchables. Second, the largest number of slaves employed in domestic work. And then we read that caste regulations prevented untouchables from being employed in domestic work. So what did they do? The contradiction leaps to the eye. And it's not meant to be a critique of the historian in question. She must continue to command greatest respect from all of us, but to underline the problems of method to which we all have fallen unwitting victims. I'll continue with this paragraph for 1 or 2 more minutes. Categories of slaves were drawn more commonly from the lower castes and untouchables. All right. Is this agreeable with this one? That the usual, look at this, usual sources were prisoners of war. Would they be untouchables and lower castes? They may or may not be, generally. Debt bondsmen and slaves born to slave women. Slave breeding, we all know from our study of slave societies in other part of the world, for which we have detailed knowledge, that slave breeding was always a minuscule activity. Slave breeding there is no iota of evidence to show that in India things could have been otherwise. Slave breeding is a very costly proposition. It did occur in ancient world, in modern times, in other parts of the world, and we just do not have any evidence that slaves. The second is debt bondsmen. Debt bondage is a negation of slavery. To sell a person who has not been able to pay his or her debts into slavery would be very contrary to the logic of debt bondage. Debt bondage means that you are not able to pay off my debt, so you work on my land, in my house, and so on. So once again, the relation can be highly problematic. And here we come to that argument of Kosambi. In fact, it was always argued that it was the caste system which obviated the need for slavery. The very rationale of the caste system that it makes available at a very cheap price the services of large masses of lower caste untouchable people to the upper ones. So that precludes, that obviates the need for slavery. So once again about that. So this is the thing, this is the problem that happens if we continue to base if we are not able to maintain a strict distinction between what is inferred and what is a statement of fact. All right. So I stop sharing and I come back to this. All right. And similarly, this Dharma Shastric evidence, how good is Dharma Shastric evidence or how bad? In the same chapter, we read, all right. So in the same chapter, we also read about one major issue about a conflict between the prescriptive, the normative evidence of Dharma Shastras and the actual indications as gleaned from works such as the Abhigyan Shakuntal of Kalidas. So the reference is to the story of fisherman in the play. So it has been invoked to raise questions about the degree to which caste taboos were observed in India. So initially, when the fisherman is suspect, so he is being taunted about his low caste status. But later, when the ring is discovered and when the fisherman is handsomely rewarded by the king, now the high caste officer, the officer, he does not mind drinking with this low caste, this untouchable fisherman at the wine shop. He says that let's go for a drink, and both of them, they go and they will have a drink. So a high caste king's man is sitting with a fisherman, an untouchable, to have a drink. So this is the conclusion. So we read about the same page that we have cited now, that an official drinking with a low caste fisherman needs some reconciling with the rules of the Dharma Shastras. Or does this prove evidence of a social flexibility generally denied in the normative texts? The Dharma Shastras would not permit this generally. So this is the argument. And this is where I bring in my point about the plural, multiple complexity of the Dharma Shastric evidence. There were more than one Dharma Shastras. There were more than one statements on the norms, on the rules of a caste society. So once again, what we do, we have formed a certain opinion about the Dharma Shastras. It's of course based on the reading of one or two, generally Manusmriti. But the Dharma Shastric evidence is complex and very rich. In fact, if we bother to look up just Kane, deliberately, I could have cited from the original sources, but I'm citing from the original sources as cited by Kane. So Kane is quoting several Shastras. I will reproduce just a few, which hold that the rules of untouchability, there was a standard, the majority of Dharma Shastras, they ruled that the rules of untouchability do not apply in emergency or at public places or on public occasions. For instance, we have Smriti, on late text, Atri. Atri is saying that in Devyatra, in Viva, in Yagyas, in Utsav, on all these occasions, Sarveshu, on all these occasions, the touchable, untouchable rule does not exist. Sprishta sprisht. Sprisht is touchable, or sprisht is untouchable. So sprishta sprishti na vidyate. This is Atri. Similarly, we have uh, Devan Bhatt as late as 13th century, beginning of 13th century, when on all accounts caste rules were very, very rigid. At that time, we find a clear statement that in village, in yatra, in fight, there is no sprishti dos, no sin in touching. Similarly, we have Sridhar's slightly earlier. He said that in a battlefield, we do have evidence of untouchables as soldiers. And he's making the point. He's saying that in battlefields, in Sangram, in on road, in yatra, even in temples, I mean, in the temple processions, yatras, in utsav, in tirthas, no touching, untouching distinction exists. Kane also quotes Brihaspati that pollution does not take place at abnormal times or on certain gay and festive occasions. So, what's happening? We need to realize that for any given time, there was no unanimity of opinion among the authors of the Shastras about the untouchables. And an analysis of this difference of views in the light of other evidence, it should help us to guess the real situation, to tell theoretical prescription from factual detail and individual attitude from customary practice, to recognize variations in custom and other things. So thus Manu is an isolated figure in this matter. Manu, he stands out almost alone in prescribing the branding of the Chandalas, forbidding their entry, and denying them among Dharma Shastras, and denying them even the functions of night watchmen. When his near contemporary Yagyavalkya Smriti, in the first book, Shlokas 194 and 197, he clarifies, what does he say? Manu is saying that do not let them enter anywhere, do not let them go. Yagyavalkya is saying that the air and rays of sun and moon purify a house entered by a Chandal or a road traversed by him. When Yagyavalkya is saying that it's daybreak or it's the Chandani, it's the rays of moon, at whatever time, Chandal comes, sun rays fall, the house is purified, the road is purified. So Yagyavalkya is patently and consciously contradicting Manu. The later practice of separate roads for untouchables in Kerala then becomes a distinct issue. It cannot be applied to all places and all times. So this later practice, it does echo. Manu survives there. Once again, Manu does not die out in 3rd century AD. Manu remains a part of the mental, of the ideological furniture of the upper classes of the state. And when we find this practice in Kerala, so it echoes part of Manu's statement. But once again, it is impossible if we take Manu too literally. So the wholesale, if we avoid untouchables completely, we have destroyed the system. Similarly, the well-known Jataka references to a woman washing her eyes on sighting a Chandal, it attests most probably to her individual reaction alone rather than to some custom of pollution by sight. No other preceding, contemporary, or later accounts of the nature of untouchability have any use for such a stringent provision. For speech there is, in later Dharma Shastras, if you speak to a Chandal, you will need to have a bath. So then we come to this relationship. It's one big red herring. We see person of one caste following some different occupation, we say that caste did not matter, caste did not exist. Things can be more, they are often more complicated than that. The relationship between the caste system and professions distinctive of different castes is very complex and dynamic. If it were as flat as we would like to believe, or as some Dharma Shastras would have us believe, then the caste system would have remained the same, that it has not, that it has maintained a dynamism of its own. There has been fission, fusion of castes, upward or downward mobility. It should serve to bring out this complex relationship between caste and professions. But caste was not the only form of social organization in early India. This should be the beginning point. For instance, there is that famous Mandsaur inscription of Vats Bhatti, referring to silk weavers. So here we find that there is a group of silk weavers, and they are taking to many other professions than silk weaving too. So it has been often cited to argue that the caste system, to the looseness, that the caste system was not as rigid as it was to become in later period. This is a standard argument which merits a fuller re-examination, this growing rigidity of the caste system. What's the meaning of it? How do we know, and what the kind of evidence which is being cited in support of this growing rigidity? One statement that caste system was relatively flexible in the earlier period is this. So it's a standard argument that in the Gupta period, caste system was not all that rigid, and here we have this Mandsaur inscription of the silk weavers. So this is what D.C. Sarkar argues. I mean, that was not his job when he was editing his excellent, indispensable Select Inscriptions, Volume 1. But he couldn't resist noting this fact of the flexibility of caste rules as revealed by this Mandsaur inscription. It's being repeated. It's there for the third time in the same chapter, Professor Thapar's chapter on threshold times in early India. All right, that it is a case of mobility, it's a case of looseness of caste system. But the point is that, as I said, not caste system was important, but the inscription does not refer at all to any caste. It is referring to a guild of silk weavers, Shreni. Shreni could mean a guild, it could have some other meaning too, as in the Arthashastra. So, society, it continued to be marked. So caste was probably the most important, the dominant form of inequality in early India, but it was not the only form. There were institutions, there were inequalities aside from those of the caste system. And here is one example that this reference, it refers not to a jati, but to a shreni. So it is not pertinent to a discussion of the flexibility or otherwise of the caste system. All right, so, but still we know about this ideology that each world, if you are being a priest, you would be a Brahmin, and Vaishyas would be traders, and so on. So each word, theoretically, this holds no meaning, still the caste system continues. That is the biggest argument for not confusing this ideology of caste system with its reality. So, but each word nevertheless was thought to be or was actually associated with some specific functions. For instance, priestly functions would be considered the preserve of Brahmins, and rulers were supposedly they were ideally they would be Kshatriyas only. All right, but this is not always the case. Once again, coming back to our Chinese writer from the 7th century AD. So Xuanzang found people of all varnas among the kings of India, not Kshatriyas alone. For instance, there were Shudra kings who were Buddhists who ruled Sindh. They were followed not by Kshatriyas once again, but by Brahmin rulers who had been ministers earlier. Ideally, no job of a Brahmin. The kings of Ujjain in central India, Kundravardhan in Bengal, were also Brahmins. All right. Harsh was a Vaishya. Maitrakas were Kshatriyas. We know from their inscriptions that they did claim Kshatriya status. Chalukyas were Kshatriyas. Maukharis, we know from their inscriptions, were Kshatriyas. Even earlier, we have the Satavahanas who claimed to be Brahmins. They were kings. What does it mean for the caste system, for the profession? It does bring out that describe the prescription people of a given varn would take up jobs not suitable for that, a different one. They may choose to remain Brahmins. They may not seek after a Kshatriya status. But there was also the pull. The connection does not go away. There are two things. First, that there was the pull of the caste ideology, that ideally, if you are a king, you should be a Brahmin. You should be a Kshatriya. Not all kings bothered about that. Satavahanas did not bother about it. We have these Parivrajak Nripas, the ascetic kings of central India, like Sangchok, son of Hastin. They all were descendants of the Brahmin called Susharman. They continued to, for generations, they were content to continue to rule as Brahmin kings. All right, but there were others who did feel charmed by the pull of this ideology. It was not that there was no linkage in the minds of the people of a varna with a profession. Because we also find that there are kings who are striving for a Kshatriya status. For instance, the Varman kings of Bengal, of Assam, we know that they were Brahmanas, as Xuanzang points out. But they call themselves, they assume the title of Varman. We know that Varman was the standard cognomen, standard suffix of a Kshatriya. And we have that well-known instance from South India of the Kadambas, where Mayur Sharman, once he becomes a king, he changes his name to Mayur Varman. Other kings would say that they won't deny their Brahmin origins, but they say that now they are Kshatriyas. They are Kshatriyas, they say having a Brahmin origin, so they are Brahmakshatras. We know this practice was also there. And we also, of course, have a number of inscriptions where a king is a Kshatriya by virtue of having performed Hiranyagarbha. Hiranyagarbha means womb, golden womb ceremony. Here, our sources say one thing, our translators and historians often do not say that. Our sources that the person is claiming to be born of golden womb. Hiranyagarbha Prasut. Normally in history books, we said that they performed this ceremony or they gave this dan, that kind of thing. But the claim is very specific. Here I am a Kshatriya because I am Prasut, I am born of a golden womb. So we have both the things, which underlines both the variation in the caste system as well as the connect with the Varna theory. All right. So this brings us finally to the last part of my lecture, what I call the curious case of the Kayastha in early India. So I will just raise the problem here. I'm still working on it. Kayasthas, we all know that they were the professional scribes. There were other names for them. So initially, when the Kayasthas are mentioned, they do not refer to any caste, but to the profession of writers and keepers of legal and other records. All right. So generally it is believed that it is after the post-Gupta period that the Kayasthas become a caste. We begin to have references to various regional castes. Castes of God. God is not Bengal. God is probably Uttar Pradesh. Or Kayasthas of other regions too. All right. So this is very puzzling. And actually, there is a dual puzzle about the emergence and status of the caste of Kayasthas in early medieval India. Why should a different caste have come up? Why the need for a different caste? When there were already well-established groups of Brahmins whose first qualification was their education. If literacy was needed, we have a class of people very well educated. And initially, we know that a large number of these Kayasthas, they came from this Brahmin caste. So why the need for a separate caste? Why should it arise at all? And the second puzzle is about the ascription of Shudra status to these professionals. Why call them Shudra? What is so servile about this thing? About being writer? The caste was defined by its profession, and it could have been nobody's case that it was ritually polluting. So this is the dual puzzle of the Kayastha caste about their emergence and status. Why have a different caste at all when we already have a literate caste? And second, why give them Shudra status? Why deny them? Ascribing them Shudra status was denied. Kayasthas, sometimes Suvira Jaiswal would say that they were happy with their Shudra status. They were not. They were claiming all the time Kshatriya status. We have this very curious and tantalizing evidence of a record of Kalchuri Chedi era from central India. The relevant parts, most of the relevant parts are mutilated, but this much is clear. They are simultaneously claiming a Brahmin status, not Kshatriya there, and they are also saying that they were descended from a Shudra. They refer to one rishi called Kachar. He is mentioned in some other records too. So this would be something like Brahma Kshatriya. In this record, if what is seen, the unmutilated part of this record What it suggests is that it could have been a case of Shudra Brahma. They are not denying that they were descended from the fourth caste, fourth Varna. But there are very clear hints at the beginning of the record that they are laying claim themselves to a Brahmin status. But later, generally, they were laying claims to Kshatriya status. The fight goes on. It's an extremely complicated matter where we cannot be too careful with our handling of the evidence, with recognizing its multiple complexities. But before that, I should also like to announce to this audience an extremely important development which the researchers of my friend, Dr. Ranjan Anand of Zakir Hussain College, they have come out with. He has been able to generally the emergence of the Kayasthas as a caste. It dates back, it doesn't begin before, 8th, 9th centuries AD, much later. He has been able to locate the emergence of Kayasthas as a caste in Gupta period itself. So I'm grateful to him for providing me with this reference. That doesn't mean that if there is one good piece of evidence about the emergence of Kayasthas, or maybe more than one, in Gupta period, it does not mean that Kayasthas emerged simultaneously as castes everywhere. There were several regional jatis of Kayasthas in different parts of India. And they did not emerge as a caste everywhere. For instance, in Kashmir, we continue to have Brahmin Kayasthas, which means it was a profession. By that time, in other parts of India, there were Kayastha castes. So, about the first puzzle, why have a different caste? How was it made possible? Why were the people who were becoming writers of the record, why did they not become part of Brahmin identity? Why were they excluded? So I think the solution to the first puzzle may lie in the fact that in early India, learning and literacy were connected, but they were not entirely coterminous. This was owing to the predominance of orality, of a listening culture in India, rather than a written culture, as in China, where prayers were not spoken but written down. Here, we create an entire Veda for the sake of sound, the Sama Veda, apart from 78 or so hymns. So more accurately, it was possible for the learned, including the most learned, to do without literacy. But the literate obviously could not do without a modicum of learning. In our inscriptions, including in the Mansoor inscription, and it becomes a standard practice, the composer of a text would not be the same as the transcriber. And the transcriber, the lekhak, the kayasth of the record, one who wrote down, was of course not the same. The transcriber was again different from inscriber. Even in Mansoor record, we find this, that the kartri, the composer, is a different person. The lekhak is yet different person. And then there's a reference to the vachakas, those who will read it out, and the audience, to the shrotas. So after all, in India, Saraswati, the goddess of learning, is one of speech. She is Vagdevi. She is not one of the written word. This distinction that you could be learned, but you need not be very good with writing. We see this in Mudra Rakshas, where he's of course Chanakya is scheming. Chanakya knows how to write, Kautilya, but he is pointing out that normally a Shrotriya Brahman, he can write, but will have a very bad, indistinct handwriting. If you want to have a properly written record, it's best to get it done by a Kayastha. So first, this distinction. Second, state administration and other affairs of the complex society, as distinct from the affairs of the non-complex stateless societies, they called for very different forms of knowledge involving, among other things, incorporation of local knowledge and vocabulary than those of the scriptural or literary or scientific traditions. A ready reckoner of this may be found in the epigraphical glossary of D.C. Sarkar. In our inscriptions, we come across lots of terms with meanings which never found a place in the dictionaries. They remained outside the lexicons and thus the mainstream education. So it was possible for a person to become a learner. So therefore, this knowledge of state administration and other affairs of state society, like in Mahabharata, we have a reference to a person that he is working at the household of a rich person. Every morning he will calculate expenditure and income for him. It was a specialized business, all right, and this was secular knowledge. So a new profession of scribes, one of preparing and keeping records of state-related matters, as well as for non-state establishments, was thus called forth as soon as we have the beginnings of a state society. The word Lipikar occurs first in Panini. As soon as we have the beginning, Lekhak is of course very important. We have Divir, we have so many other terms, and then we have the all-important Kayastha. So Brahmins would have been the first, they were the first to fill the vacancies, but obviously there was nothing Brahmanical or religious about it. This was a separate secular career, not a religious vocation, and hence, aside from the learned quarters, people from other walks of life may choose to opt for it. The power and privilege of scribes are too large over the face of society to require much persuasion about its charm. I'm reminded of the description of the privileges of the Egyptian scribe as Gordon Childe once described in one of his books. About the second puzzle, the ascription of Shudra status, I'm afraid I can only raise the issue here, cannot discuss it at any length, but I can only note here at the end that it is, I'm repeatedly saying it, it's very complicated. One of the first, perhaps the first major engagement, first major write-up on this issue about the history of Kayastha, it was made by P.V. Karne in New Indian Antiquaries, first volume in 1939. How does it begin? He's saying that it's a vexed question. He doesn't want to go into it. And he's a reformist. And actually he wants that not the Kayasthas, but all Hindus of this country should be given the status of Dvijas. Everyone should be twice born, not the Kayasthas. And then he goes on to write his usual excellent small piece on the Kayasthas. The debate about the status of that why they should be called, you see, there are two things, not just that this profession of writing and maintaining of records, it was not polluting, of course, but the Brahmins wanted it for themselves. There are clear statements, for instance, in Devan Bhatt's Smriti Chandrika, that this job of Ganak, of Lekhak, it should be there only for Dvijas. That is my clue. That is my clue, and it's amply verified by the sources of my period. But as I said, the problem doesn't die out. It varied from region to region. We all know about it. We all have read R.S. Sharma's Social Changes in Early Medieval India, where he doesn't cite it as such, but he is actually quoting from one part of the observations of P.V. Karne, that how one high court would call them Shudras, the other high court would call them not Brahmins but Dvijas, but not two high courts. uh, it's not even unrelated to, in Maharashtra, the conflict was particularly acute. It's not even unrelated to Shivaji claiming, to that famous episode of Shivaji claiming and successfully being endowed a Kshatriya status by that famous Pandit from Benares, Gaga Bhatt. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, sir, for delivering this Carvan special lecture. It was an honor listening to you on such an important topic, and I think the questions, the problems you have raised in today's today's lecture, I think many of us who are watching it will go home, they'll research, and hopefully new avenues of research will come up after this very important lecture that you have presented this evening. Thank you so much. And if our viewers have any question for Dr. Jha, they can write it down in the comments and we'll answer those there. Or you can email us at carvanheritage@gmail.com and we'll forward those emails to Professor Jha and he can get back to you through emails. So thank you so much and thank you, sir, for taking out time to deliver this lecture.
Thank you.